Hey there. Tonight, we're not heading towards castles or crowns. We're going to the quiet edges of history. The parts rarely painted. We're talking about medieval peasants. The ones who didn't ride horses or wear jewels. The ones who survived. Plagues, hunger, biting cold, and 100 small daily hardships. All without fancy titles, no grand glory. No lasting legacy. Just long days, short nights, and a quiet kind of strength most of us couldn't last a day in. If this gentle, slow journey into the past helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there, settling down to the same quiet story. So dim your lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable, and let's begin. At the very edge of the map, picture a village without a name, or if it had one, no one remembers it now. It sits in a gentle valley, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Just a soft fold in the land, far enough away to avoid big roads, official records, or royal attention. You wouldn't find it on a map. Actually, you'd never even seen a map. Here, your world ends where the trees begin. The forest is thick, dark, and moves slowly, like something ancient barely putting up with your presence. Fields stretch out in messy patches of green and brown, worked until exhausted, then worked some more. Somewhere north, they say, there's a river. You've never seen it. It's talked about like dragons or saints, distant and mysterious. This is where you were born. This is where you will die. Maybe just 60 steps from cradle to grave. The houses? They're rough. They slump, like the wind pushed against them too many winters in a row. The walls are made of wattle and daub. That's sticks woven together, then plastered with mud, straw, and manure. Patched endlessly with whatever scraps the weather hasn't stolen yet. Roofs sag under heavy thatch, always leaking in spots you just can't reach. The village smells: wet wool, wood smoke, damp earth, a sharp tang of animals, and sometimes a hint of rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It's just the smell of being here. The road in isn't really a road. It's just a muddy track worn deep by ox carts, collecting rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has traveled it in years. Maybe ever. Most days pass quietly. A distant bell marks the hours from a chapel in another village. If the wind carries the sound. Otherwise, you tell time by the sun's position, the length of shadows across the field, or the deep ache settling into your back long before noon. Maybe a dozen families live here. Enough to fill a small gathering on special holy days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's problems. And everyone politely ignores them until they absolutely can't. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom. He once spoke to a monk, and now he repeats that single conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one argues. Tom's hut hasn't fallen down. His goat looks healthy. That's about as close to leadership as anyone needs. Nothing here is exact. No written records, no land deeds, no surveys. Boundaries? They're understood by landmarks, the old elm tree, or where the ground gets soft and squishy. If there's a fight over land, it's handled with a shrug, maybe a short argument, and sometimes passing a loaf of bread back and forth until no one wants to argue anymore. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger does arrive, it's talked about for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell like the sea? A new person is both fascinating and a little scary, and no one leaves. Not really. Travel? That's more like a rumor. You've heard of towns, cities, places where stone buildings reach 2, even 3 stories high. But those are just stories, like talking animals or women turning into birds. How can you miss a world you've never seen? The forest is too dense. The hills are too long. The roads, if they exist, are known more for robbers and bad luck than any promise of adventure. What would you do if you got to one of those distant places? You don't speak the language properly. You have no money. You don't know the customs. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay. There's safety in the familiar, even if it's hard, even if it's boring. Even if the roof leaks, the well runs low, and the same stew has been bubbling for 3 days straight. There's comfort in routine. Knowing where the firewood is stacked. Knowing who to ask when your fence collapses. Knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring the sheep in. You wake with the light. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It isn't much, but it's life. And somehow, in the quiet rhythm of it all, there's a kind of peace. A peace that doesn't ask questions. A peace that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what you can see from the top of the nearest hill. You might hear whispers now and then about a war, a king dying, a comet in the sky that scared a village 5 days' walk away. But the news never seems to reach you directly. Just stories pass through too many mouths. They lose their urgency somewhere between the traveling merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't change neatly. They bleed into each other. A damp spring becomes a wet summer. A hard frost turns into a winter that eats through your boots. You don't count years. You count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The terrible one when the rye turned black and rotten. The good one where the barley grew thick and heavy. And even old Marjorie smiled for a whole week. Maybe once a year, the Lord's steward comes. He collects grain, asks sharp questions, writes things down. You answer carefully. Never too much detail. He doesn't seem to like detail. You've never met the king. You're not really sure what he does. But you know his name, and you say it in your prayers, just in case it matters. Because here, on the edge of the map, most things don't change. And when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still, the fire glows. The roof mostly holds. The cottage is warm. Tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills. And for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles. But almost all of them will be in circles. Most medieval peasants never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Not because they weren't curious or energetic, though good boots were a luxury, but because the world beyond the next hill simply didn't belong to them. The idea of going to find it? That felt as impossible as flying. You grew up learning every inch of land between your home and the field's edge. You knew the shape of every tree stump on the path to the well. You could tell who walked the road just by their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that felt unreal. The next village over might only be 5 miles away, but it felt like a foreign country. You'd heard stories about it. Who married whom, who stole a goat, who said the priest snored during mass, but you hadn't seen it. And you likely never would. Why? Travel was dangerous. Not exciting dangerous. Quiet, exhausting, possibly deadly dangerous. Roads weren't nice paths with signs and cozy inns. They were muddy tracks through forests, fields, and long stretches of empty, silent land. No maps, no directions. Just vague advice like, go till you see the leaning pine tree, then left past the rock that looks like a sleeping pig. And on those paths? Worries. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't pretty parks. They were dense, dark, tangled with roots, full of noises you couldn't name. Boars, wolves, people hiding who really didn't want to be found. If you weren't born knowing the woods, they didn't want you there. Second, bandits. People with nothing to lose and no land to farm. Travelers were easy targets, especially if they looked even a little well-fed. A man walking fast might seem like he had coins. A woman alone might have something worth stealing. You learned fast that acting brave was an armor. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a small problem. Wander off the track? No one was coming to find you. You couldn't just follow a river downstream hoping for help. You could walk for days without seeing another soul. Your body could vanish into the undergrowth like smoke. People back home wouldn't know you were missing until the next feast day when someone finally asked, "Where's John?" And someone else just shrugged. Then there were the practical reasons. If you traveled too far, who would tend your field? Who would feed your animals? What if the Lord's steward came to collect taxes while you were gone? You couldn't explain being away to a man holding a list. Your duties didn't pause because you were curious. And even if you made it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought trouble, disease, crime, strange ideas. You spoke a bit differently, used different words, maybe even held your spoon oddly. You could be met with suspicion, or worse. Food was scarce. Beds were full. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. The safest place was home. Not because it was perfectly safe, but because it was known. You knew where. The roof leaked, which chickens wandered off, which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking 20 questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel sometimes, not peasants usually, but merchants, monks, messengers, people with protection or a clear job to do. You might see them once or twice a year, coming through with carts of wool or salted fish, trailing stories. Behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities, stone buildings, shops selling spices, streets that didn't turn to mud soup every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dream too hard, because even if it was true, what would you do there? You couldn't read. You owned no coins. You wouldn't know the customs. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would. Even know your name. So you stayed. Not always because you were scared, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to do, a fence to mend, a niece to watch, barley to dry, a dozen tasks that all needed doing before sunset. And because, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had gossip and arguments, weather and sickness, small, fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells, sometimes, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of making it through another day. Sure, sometimes you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods. But most days, you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave. Usually the desperate, the reckless, or the very ambitious. A young man might set off looking for work, adventure, or a cause worth dying for. He might come back with a limp and a story, or not at all. When he didn't return, no one said much. They just shook their heads and said, "He went beyond the trees," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also deeply known. You weren't lonely. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in the familiar routines, the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand the value of warmth. You didn't need to taste cinnamon to know the joy of slightly sweet bread. You didn't need to cross a kingdom to feel love, sorrow, boredom, or hope. As the years passed, aches settled deeper. Children grew taller than the fence posts, and the idea of travel faded. Not with regret, but with understanding. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. Your home wasn't built from blueprints or neatly labeled lumber. It was a compromise. A deal struck between needing shelter and what the weather and land would grudgingly allow. You started with a frame, rough-hewn timbers cut from nearby trees, using tools passed down through more hands than you could count. The wood wasn't straight. It bent. It warped. But so would your walls, so it didn't matter much. Once the frame was up, you wove thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts. This was called wattle. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't quick. But it held together mostly. Then came the daub, a mix of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slapped it on by hand, pressing it into the gaps, smoothing it just enough to hopefully keep the wind out. It dried slowly, cracking in the sun, sometimes falling off in clumps that had to be patched before winter. You got used to the smell. Eventually, you stopped noticing it. The roof, thatch. Layers of dried straw packed tightly and tied to the beams. Fresh, it looked golden, almost pretty. Then came the rain, then the birds, then time. The color faded. The edges frayed, holes appeared. You started placing buckets in spots you hoped you'd never need them. You didn't shingle it, you didn't waterproof it. You just kept patching it until the whole roof was more patch than thatch. You wondered sometimes if living under a cart might be easier. The floor? Dirt. You told yourself it was packed firm. And it was sort of. Years of walking, sweeping, spilling, and stomping had made it almost solid. But when it rained, it softened. When it froze, it cracked. When the goats came in for the night, well, who knew what was underfoot then? You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helped. A little. But soon the straw got damp, dirty, walked into dust. Then you swept it out and started over, or you didn't. Eventually, the straw became the floor, and you accepted it. Windows? Technically, just openings in the wall, covered with wooden shutters that swung awkwardly and never closed flush. Glass? Too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind came in. The cold came in. The sounds of the animals outside came in. Sometimes the animals themselves came in. The door usually hung a little crooked because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latched with a hook or a wooden peg, not for security. There was nothing to steal, but to keep the chickens from wandering out and the wind from wandering. Inside, mostly one room. Maybe two if someone managed to add a lean-to or a loft. But usually, just one big room. This is where you slept, ate, cooked, mended tools, talked, argued, and hoped. Everyone lived here. Parents, children, maybe a cousin, a grandparent, perhaps a neighbor's child whose parents were sick or gone. All together, not always out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm room. In the center, the hearth. Built of stone if you were lucky, clay if you weren't. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof. More or less. No chimney. The air inside was always smoky, a little warm, a little damp, always carrying the quiet scent of stew that had been reheated one too many times. Furniture? Limited. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest if someone was good at carving or lucky in marriage. Beds? Wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared, usually squeaked. Blankets? Wool, heavy, rough, never quite dry storage. Up in the rafters, garlic, onions, herbs, maybe a small ham if the pig was generous that year. You could smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by sniffing the air above your head. Sometimes comforting, sometimes a reminder of how close you were to running out. Animals? Part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the corner. Chickens too. A goat. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't clean. But it was warm. You learned to tune out the clucks, the shuffles, the occasional startled bleat in the night. They were background noise, like wind in the thatch or the walls slowly settling. Nothing was level. The floor dipped, the roof slanted. The walls bulged. Slightly, like the whole place was breathing in and out with the seasons. You fixed what you could. You ignored what you couldn't. Every spring you swore you'd repair the back wall. Every autumn, it was still leaning. It wasn't a house built to last centuries. It was built to get through the next storm. And yet for all its flaws, it was home. You knew where the cold draft came in and how to block it with an old sack. You knew which roof beam you could hang the cooking pot from, and which one creaked if someone stood too close. You knew how the afternoon light fell through the slats, and where the dog liked to curl up. Strangers saw poverty. You saw effort, reuse, resourcefulness, a roof that hadn't collapsed, a victory, a fire still burning at dawn, a blessing, a dry corner, worth more than gold. Lying down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores, silence, smoke, and straw. You felt a strange comfort, not pride, exactly, but presence. This was your space. It bent, it leaked, it shifted in the wind, but it held. And so had you. For the average medieval peasant, food wasn't an exciting experience. It wasn't colorful, diverse, or even reliably warm. It was a daily problem to solve, using the same few pieces, hoping something edible would come out of it. Your kitchen was just a corner near the hearth. No pantry, no shelves full of ingredients. Just a pot, a fire, and a short list of things you hoped hadn't spoiled. At the center of almost every meal, pottage, an eternal stew that lived in the pot, never entirely new, never entirely gone. You added to it during the day, you skinned it at night. You kept it warm through the seasons, praying nothing strange grew in it when you weren't looking. What went in? Whatever you had. On a good day, cabbage, leeks, barley, a few beans or peas, maybe garlic or onions if the harvest was kind. Winter, dried beans or peas. If you were very lucky, a scrap of salted pork or maybe just the bone. You could boil that bone for days, hoping it remembered what meat tasted like. The flavor? Consistent, earthy, gray, more about warmth than taste. You didn't eat pottage for fun. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at day's end was a small victory. Pot itself, never really clean. Wiped down, maybe scraped, rarely scrubbed. The next batch always tasted a bit like the last one. No spices to cover it, no vinegar to brighten it. Just a slow, dependable dullness. A taste like boiled history. The other star? Bread, not soft, golden, or inviting. Hard, dense, dark, made from rye, barley, or oats. Soft white wheat bread? That was for the rich folks. Peasant loaves were small, heavy, didn't rise much, and crumbled quickly. Leave one out for a day, and it could double as a weapon. But it filled your stomach and gave you something to soak up the stew. Sometimes the flour was questionable. Ground up chaff, peas, whatever was left at the miller's bottom. In hard times, people used bark, literally. Ground up inner tree bark mixed with what little flour they had. Famine bread, bitter, dense, barely digestible. It kept you alive ... technically ... on days when even flour was scarce. People used trenchers, thick slices of old bread used as plates. These soaked up the stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or thrown to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down to someone of lower status. Bread hierarchy. Protein? Rare. Very rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. You didn't eat your livestock unless you had no choice. When you did, you used every part. Meat, fat, organs, bones. Blood was used for puddings. Fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Nothing wasted. Pork was the most common meat when available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavored many dishes. But pigs were only slaughtered when necessary. A whole pig meant weeks of planning. Fishing? An option near water, but often restricted. Many rivers belonged to lords. Fish without permission, risk a fine or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river fish, anything that wouldn't rot fast. Salted herring was a prize. The church dictated your diet too. Fridays and during Lent, no meat, so you pivoted to fish. Or went without. Sometimes, creatively, beaver tails were classified as fish. A theological workaround few questioned. Because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common, but spoiled fast. Use it quickly or turn it into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury. Cheese was harder, tangier, often dry. Having a few rounds stored meant the cow had been generous. Dairy didn't always agree with people. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid, cheese molded. You cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was strong. Drinks? Simple. Water was often unsafe, so ale was the default. Weak ale, called small beer, was brewed at home and drunk by everyone, including children. Low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and dull the edge of thirst. If you had apples or pears, cider, wine. For clergy and nobles, mead, rare, milk for the young or sick. Otherwise, ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, ale to help forget. Tomorrow would taste like today. Vegetables were the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, carrots. Though not orange ones back then. White or purple. Grown in small gardens, eaten root to leaf, nothing wasted. Turnip tops, boiled greens, skins, composted or tossed in the fire. Fruit, seasonal, apples mostly, maybe berries or wild plums. Eat them fast or dry them for winter. Preserving was hard. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you had bees, was treasured. Otherwise, your pottage stayed savory in the loosest sense. Herbs, grown if possible, parsley, sage, dill, mint, used more for medicine or tradition than flavor. Some herbs thought to protect against illness or pests. Making things taste better? A happy accident, not the gold. Meals were eaten together on benches around the fire. No courses, no fancy recipes. Just a pot, a hunk of bread, and hope there'd be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't thicken the stew. Feast days? A wedding, harvest festival, Saint's Day. You might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not flaky pastry. A medieval pie was a sealed box of hard dough holding a meat filling, heavily spiced if spices were available, usually not. Flavor with pepper, ginger, or cinnamon, only if someone traded well. But most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl. You soaked your bread. You drank your ale. You leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in the repetition, knowing the pot's taste, knowing how much bread was left, watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire, as wind whispered through the wall cracks and animals shifted in their sleep. The stew boiled, the bread cooled, and once again, you had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. Not really. That patch of land you farmed, the few tools, your animals, the crooked house you built, technically, it all belonged to the Lord, not a far-off king, but your local landholder. The one living up the hill in a slightly less crooked house with slightly better food and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, so he owned everything on it. Including, in a way, you were called a villain. Not an insult, just a category. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and respect. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. You didn't talk to the Lord. You talked to his steward, the man who managed the land and, crucially, kept track of what everyone owed. And you owed a lot. First, labor. Several days a week, sometimes more during harvest, you worked the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was corvée labor. You got nothing for it. No pay, no thanks. Just the knowledge that someone in the manor house ate better because of your sweat. Second, taxes, many kinds, a portion of your grain, a share of your wool. A chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale tax. Had a pig, bacon tax. Caught fish, guess who owned they? River, taxes didn't stop with food. Use the Lord's mill? Pay a fee. Even though it was the only way to grind your grain, and the Lord owned it and set the price. Grind it yourself? Often illegal, punishable by fine or worse. The Lord didn't just want his share, he wanted control. Same with the oven, many manners. Had one big communal oven you paid to use, baking at home? Risked consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it cost more and made less sense. Then came the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? Fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission, then pay a fee. Livestock taxed. Tools sometimes taxed. Your ability to get married without permission? Barely. Untaxed. What did you get in return? The Lord was supposed to protect you. In theory, if bandits attacked or a rival noble invaded, the Lord had armed men to fight. If famine struck, he might give out grain from his stores, rarely for free. If you had a dispute, your neighbor's goat eating your garden. The Lord's court might settle it. Again, not free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in words like loyalty and protection. In practice, a system of ownership. Land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart, often on higher ground, made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant home. Inside, tapestries, tables, servants, and the Lord himself, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed, how many eggs promised, if your son was old enough to be added to the labor list. Everything recorded, not by you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff. Men with wax tablets or parchment, coming around with questions. You learn to answer carefully. Fail to meet obligations? Punishments, fines, more goods taken, extra days of labor. In extreme cases, tools confiscated, land taken back. Your house, your goats, your dignity, all gone. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion. It was foolishness. But here's the thing, the system worked. Not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable, if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. No sudden surprises. Just a steady, grinding rhythm. Give, give, give. Occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord gave something back. A feast day with food, a holiday with no labor, a kind word from horseback. Not enough to balance things, but enough to keep hope flickering. The relationship was never friendly, but it endured. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above you. You bowed when he passed. You took off your cap. You used the right words. Not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe, deep down, a small part of you hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted up, even just a little. It almost never happened. But that faint hope helped keep the system alive. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking. The reeve kept writing. The mill kept grinding. And you kept digging your hands into the soil, year after year, season after season. No retirement, no bonus, no moving up. Only the quiet knowledge you'd done your part. You'd fulfilled your role. You'd made it through another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. Long before the terrifying Black Death swept across Europe, medieval peasants knew sickness well. Not just seasonal colds, though plenty of those, but the slow, constant threat of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting away, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an unusual event. It was a regular part of life. You didn't need a continent-wide disaster to be struck down. A small cut, a single flea, a sip of water that looked clear, but WASN single quotes that was enough. And unlike bad weather or taxes, sickness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning and rarely left quietly. No hospitals. Not really. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman or a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which to burn. Extremely lucky? A monk nearby, literate, well-meaning. Maybe slightly better than just praying. Mostly, when you got sick, you stayed home. You lay in bed. You sweated through your shirt. And you hoped. Most people didn't know what caused disease. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes were centuries away. What they had were old, confusing, often wrong theories. Some believed in miasma, bad air carrying disease through smell. If a village smelled of rot, manure, and smoke, it was thought dangerous, which was accidentally partly right, but for the wrong reasons. To fight bad air, people stuffed herbs in their clothes, carried flowers, or walked around with vinegar soaked. Wraps pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, but deeply believed. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness came from sin, impure thoughts, disobedience, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, a test. If crops failed and your body failed, probably your fault. Or your neighbors. Or both. Local traditions. 2. The evil eye, a jealous glare, moon phases. Animal spirits, grumpy saints. One popular idea? Sickness entered through the solace of the feet. Solution? Boil them. If that didn't work, burn something nearby. Maybe your mattress. The cures? Often as strange as the causes. Fever? You might be bled. A local man, with more confidence than training, arrived with a blade and a bowl, sometimes leeches. The idea was to balance your body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Invisible fluids blamed for everything. Swelling, poultices. Mashed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied on. Some worked, most didn't. A few made things worse. Stomach ache? Chew charcoal, coughing blood. Drink wine mixed with crushed pearls, if you could afford pearls. Blurry eyes? Someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. Leg turned black? Probably out of options. Then there were charms and amulets, bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, inscribed with protective words or blessed by a priest. Some buried onions in house corners. Others hung garlic above the door. One remedy? Tie a live chicken to the infected area, hoping the illness would jump to the bird. Rarely worked, but hope was precious. Sickness was isolating, but not like today. You didn't quarantine. You didn't call for help. You just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you lay down. Others carried on. Children were fed. Animals were fed. You were given broth maybe, and a few murmured prayers. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke. The swelling went down. You walked again, maybe with a limp, a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times, it didn't. Your family lit a candle. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic Black Death kind. More often, it was slow infection. Skin darkening, limb swelling, a deep rattling cough, smallpox, leprosy, dysentery. Even the flu could sweep through and leave half the village in bed. No case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveler said the cough started there last week. Heard 3 children died near the river. You paid attention, boiled more water, left herbs under the door. Kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death wasn't always feared, but it was recognized. People knew the signs: breathing slowing, skin cooling, eyes turning dull. Prayers for the dying were whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally arrived in the 14th century, it hit with terrifying force. But by then, The world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night wasn't new. It was just happening more often, more violently. Buboes, swellings in neck groin, fever stealing minds, blood darkening. People died in days, sometimes hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untended. Bells rang too often. Some peasants fled, but disease travels faster than feet. Others turned fiercely to religion, doubling prayers, whipping themselves, promising to be better if spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, sinners, anyone but the wind. The church offered explanations, comfort, and burial, though monks and priests died too. In some places, death became so common funerals were skipped. Bodies buried. In mass graves, often without names. And yet, life continued. People learned to survive around sickness. They accepted it like hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with tired resilience. They cleaned homes more often, shared herbs, whispered new prayers. Some believed surviving one sickness gave protection against the next. Others didn't believe, but got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which to chew, which to boil, how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better, and when to stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested what they could. They shared meager meals. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness and the time someone's grandfather survived. A winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another brutal part of it. For those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come. And if it didn't, someone else would remember your name. Or, at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent. Like a cave is silent. Full of creaks, distant animal sounds, and a quiet so deep you notice how loud your own body is. Your heartbeat, your breathing. The day ended when the light failed. Anything not put away had to be dealt with fast, because once darkness fell, your world shrank to the size of your hearth's glow. No bright artificial light. Wax candles were too valuable. If you had a tallow lamp, animal fat, it was saved for emergencies or deep prayers. Most nights, the fire dimmed to coals. That soft glow was all you had, and so you slept. But not in one long stretch like we do today. Sleep came in 2 acts. First sleep, then a waking period, then second sleep. This rhythm wasn't a choice. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours. You drifted into first sleep not long after nightfall. The fire banked. Animals quieted. Children hushed. The one-room house stretched into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was lumpy straw or feathers, often shared. If not, you slept on woven rushes or the packed earth. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, even servants, all in one shared space, not always for closeness, but for warmth. On the coldest nights, animals came inside too. A goat near the door, a dog by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth mattered more than privacy. Sleeping alone, that felt like punishment, not comfort. The rich might afford it. Everyone else just made do. You turned to face the wall, stuffed straw in your ears, shared blankets, breathed each other's breath. And if someone snored, someone always did. You got used to it. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, like clockwork, people woke. It wasn't disturbing. It was expected. This waking time, often around midnight, was still and quiet. Some people prayed. Others stirred the coals. Some used the chamber pot or stepped outside into the freezing air. Others just lay still, reflecting. Some whispered. It was also a time for vivid dreams. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, the sacred and the everyday. Dreams during this waking interval were remembered and talked about seriously the next morning. Eventually, second sleep began. Deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. When aches faded a little. When the day's blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If not, you just lay still, waiting for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go completely silent. The fire crackled. Wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss. A cow might shuffle. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. Everyone noticed. No one said anything. It was understood. Fear of the dark was real, and not irrational. The night held dangers, real and imagined. Wolves, their howls sometimes close enough to raise the hairs on your neck. Not legends, real, hungry, thieves and rogues. Fires starting from a careless ember, roofs groaning under heavy snow. And less explainable things, ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out. They're to protect the household. You followed rituals. Place iron by the door. Make the sign of the cross above the hearth. Whisper protective blessings over the straw mattress. Hang protective herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, above doorways. Sometimes tie string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, some. Families believed sleep left you vulnerable, that your soul wandered while your body rested. So people tucked in carefully. Covered mirrors. Faced the bed toward the fire. Avoided sleeping with feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy, seeping through walls, thatch, and poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under fluffy comforters. They layered wool tunics, fur cloaks, whatever clothes they had. Undressing for bed? That would seem absurd. You slept in your clothes. Sometimes even in your boots. Sleeping next to others brought comfort, but also discomfort. Elbows, knees, the family dog surprising you in the night. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness you found a strange security. Hearing your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother a prayer in her sleep. It was deeply human. Shared. Your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake, illness, a broken tooth, death. You learned to interpret them, or found someone in the village who could. The church had its own ideas, warning that some dreams were from the devil, that sleep was a time of temptation. You were told to pray before bed, avoid bad thoughts, keep your soul ready, because the night could be your last. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold. A fever could rise. A cough could deepen. By morning, someone might be gone, quietly, like they'd been stolen. This uncertainty made every morning feel slightly sacred. When light returned, the rooster crowed and the coals were stirred back to life. It meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly, every joint reminding you of your age, no matter how. Young you were, the cold bit your nose, you wiped your face. Looked around, counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was gently checked on. Then, once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water fetched, bread prepared, animals fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared, and the memory of the night faded. Not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, waking hour. Second sleep, a world without clocks, but not without its own deep, enduring routine. Some years you're simply hungry. You stretch food, ration, hope. Other years, you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger has rules. Famine breaks them. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare, and there's no pretending next week will be better. Food becomes an idea, not a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in spring, too much rain or none at all. The barley came up patchy. Beans flowered, then browned. Cabbages cracked open too early. Wheat heads stayed small and bowed, like they were already mourning. You noticed, everyone did. At first, no one said it. But looks were exchanged. Quiet calculations made. How much is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat now? The answers were never good. The hardest part? Knowing what to do next. Not in winter, but in summer. That's when you face terrible choices. Plant the seeds for a harvest that might never come. Or grind them into flour to feed your child one more bowl of something warm. So, portions shrank. The stew got thinner. The bread got smaller. Bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic, not yet. You told yourself, this happened once before. Maybe another village has extra. Maybe the manor stores will help. Hope was still on the table. Just not much else. By August, harder to ignore. By September, impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens went quiet. Goats grew hollow-eyed. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and followed you closely, like it understood it was next. Bread became a ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with care. The stew? Now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up plants you didn't recognize, hoping they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not from fear, but because your empty stomach reminded you every few hours. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was bad. They didn't ask for bread. Didn't beg for honey. Didn't want stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned to wait. Your neighbors? You stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No laughter. No arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or the crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes someone brought back a rabbit, a bird, or a handful of acorns, soaked and ground. You chewed them, even bitter. You smiled anyway, not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manor. Sometimes they gave grain. Sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. Good, because he wasn't taking. Bad, because he wasn't helping. His silence spoke volumes. The church did what it could. Bread after Mass, alms for the poorest. But they were stretched thin too. You prayed more. Not always from deep faith, but from repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired for anything else. Some left the village entirely, wandering to find work, food, or God. Some returned. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. Your body changes in famine. You feel your ribs from the inside, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower. You bruise easier. You wake with hands clenched, like they're still gripping tools you can't use. The cold hurts more. The fire becomes your best friend. You spend more time tending it than cooking on it. You sit close, sleep facing it. Feed it wood, even as your belly stays empty, because heat is the one comfort you can still give. Eventually, you ate everything: roots, weeds, dried beans, stale flour. Boiled bones 3 times over, soaked bark. Baked famine bread so hard it cracked your tooth. When that was gone, you looked at things that weren't food. Leverets, young rabbits, boiled and salted. Not delicious, barely satisfying, but technically chewable. Finding a rat once, you didn't scream. You thanked God, cooked it alone, told no one. You still felt guilty, but you didn't regret it. Dreams turned strange. Feasts with roast meat, bread, wine. Waking up chewing your tongue. boiling things over and over, even though the pot was cold, animals coming back, green shoots breaking through snow, dreams of your childhood when hunger was simpler, and some nights, dreams of being full. You woke from those crying. The graveyard grew, slowly at first, then quickly, then too fast to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring, meaning no one had the strength to lift the rope. The grave was shallow, the prayer short, the mourning silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to mourn, but couldn't afford the energy. You held it back, like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended. Not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came and stayed. The ground softened. Seeds sprouted. Plants reached up, weak but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others. Children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it. When the first good loaf came out of the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before eating. You remembered every day without, every trick used, every lie told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you could walk properly, the church had already marked you long ago. The church had already claimed you. It took your name at baptism, blessed your first breath with Latin words you'd never understand. It stitched your soul into a system far bigger than your village. You belonged to the church, not because you chose to, but because there was no other choice. Out in the quiet corners of your life, dim mornings before the fire caught, wet nights when wind howled through the shutters, you felt its presence, like gravity. It didn't just exist beside your life. It organized it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, defined what came after it. The church wasn't a place you visited on Sundays. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year, the voice murmuring over your grave, and whispering about it decades before you got there. The village priest, often the only person who could read, wasn't just your confessor. He was your calendar, your counselor, the closest thing to an oracle you had. He held the mysteries of the sky, the stories of the saints, and knew why a pig might die or a storm might come. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and threat in his robes. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved. Because love, you were told, required obedience. Latin was the language of mass. It might as well have been a magic spell. You stood in the cold church beside your family, feet numb, listening to words that didn't belong to you. You didn't know what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible happened. That the bread wasn't bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that murmuring and gestures could move the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you. You mouthed along where you could, crossed yourself when others did, learned the rhythm of holiness like you learned the path to the well, without understanding every step, only that. You needed it. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces. Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what you could eat and when. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the rich, turnips for you. On saint days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full. Of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, the tithe. No matter the season, grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your animals, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion, but God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward with his ledgers and silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, always bigger than your home. You saw neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the priest prayed for the mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back. But the church didn't just take, it gave too. Though not always what you wanted, it gave stories. It gave structure. It gave reasons. When your cow died mysteriously, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he said it might be a test, a punishment, or the devil slipping through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings, told you to light a candle, visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told by firelight. You called on them when desperate, whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. Made deals, save my child, and I'll bring bread to the altar, ... Sometimes they seemed to listen. That was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a rare chance to leave. For a few days, you stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your whole life. Walked unknown roads toward shrines you'd only heard of. Carried your prayers strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. Slept under hedges or in barn corners, arrived footsore and raw. Stood before a bone or statue, hoping something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed, but changed. Or at least tired enough to believe you were. Even death was a ritual run by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words, touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. Candles lit. The bell might ring if someone had strength. You were buried on sacred ground. Then came the masses for your soul. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years, centuries, or longer, unless someone helped. Unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through, so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread. The rich gave land. All to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared, because fear was also part of the church's gift. It explained the world when no one else could. Why rains failed. Why your child didn't wake. Why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you suffering had purpose. Obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos. And that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power. Not seriously. Not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe. Curse softly when the priest looked away. But you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was terrifying. Even when the priest drank too much. Even when the bishop demanded outrageous taxes. Even when the indulgent seller passed through with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which, in the end, was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You stayed inside the structure because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins were counted and forgiven. You hoped the church, in all its weight, mystery, dust, and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think, after all they endured, famines, plagues, taxes, the Lord's heavy boot, peasants would have risen up constantly. That centuries of suffering would build until it exploded one cold morning. That they'd gather in fields, tools in hand, fire in their hearts, shouting, "We kneel no more." But they didn't. Not often, not for long. Never all at once. Yes, there were revolts. The Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381. The Jacquerie in France. Small uprisings scattered like stones thrown into a pond. Angry voices where lords took too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned, a steward run out of town, a banner lifted. But those fires burned fast, and were snuffed out faster. They ended in executions, gallows built in village squares. A silence heavier than before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors. Not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship, year after grinding year. They lived under a low ceiling where hope was rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage. They lacked margin. In a life spent just keeping the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion, plan a revolt, or dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth? The system worked, not because it was just or kind, but because it was ancient. Its roots sank deep into generations of habit. It didn't need explaining. It simply was. You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed. You were born into that debt. Unless exceptionally lucky, you died in it. But within those bounds, you could survive. Barely. Yes, the cost of stepping outside was too high. The manor had soldiers. The church had excommunication, being cut off from God's grace. The king had laws you'd never seen but still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. Banishment, starvation. Your family left to carry your debt. Everyone knew stories. A father taken, a mother whipped, a cousin who vanished after refusing to pay. Stories passed down not to stir rebellion, but to prevent it. Besides, rebellion felt impossible because the people beside you weren't strangers. They were kin, neighbors. You shared fields, tools, fences, prayers. Even if you hated the steward, you might marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to mass. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor tear apart without tearing yourself apart. Revolting against the manor was, in a small way, revolting against the rhythms of your own life. Centuries later, it's easy to imagine the peasant as eternally submissive, head bowed, hat in hand. But that picture misses the truth. Submission wasn't servitude, it was negotiation. Most peasants didn't just suffer. They adapted, they bartered, they bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes there. A pig kept off the ledger. An extra sack of rye buried, a bribe paid in eggs instead of coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. They were practical people. Their world wasn't run by big ideas, but by weather. The question wasn't what is just, but will this feed us through winter? Justice, if it came, was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords changed. Priests were replaced. Rules shifted. But the wind still blew. The soil still needed turning. Children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that. You endured it. The church played its part too, maybe more effectively than swords. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth. Though it never said when. You were taught your trials were purification, not punishment. That obedience would be rewarded, not here, but in the next life. And if heaven's promise wasn't enough, the threat of hell filled the rest. Fire, torment, gnashing teeth, waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. Yet peasants weren't passive. Their resistance was just quieter. They gossiped about the steward, sang rude songs about the Lord's habits, laughed when the priest stumbled over Latin, told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in small acts, a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just slightly differently than the rules said. Their rebellion was in the way they survived despite it all. Not because they accepted the system, but because they made it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes things did change. A lord died and his son was kinder. A new bishop forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful they were mortal too. But these changes came from above. The peasants' job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, to teach their children to be quiet when they had to be, and brave when they could be. And there were dreams, of course. Not of revolution maybe, but of a different life. A day when your child wouldn't carry the same burdens, when no one knocked with a list of dues, when your back didn't ache before 30, when you could sleep without worrying about wolves, soldiers, or winter. Those dreams kept you going, but they lived beside reality. You didn't expect them to come true. You just needed them to stay alive. What's most astonishing isn't that peasants revolted so rarely. It's that they kept their culture, their faith, their families intact under that crushing weight. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down, passed stories from hearth to hearth, remembered healing plants, taught each other how to pray, birth children, bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings, crusades, and plagues. And they did it not with banners or battles, but with persistence. Persistence was their rebellion. When the manner demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil still remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them like in later centuries, with speeches and slogans. But there was a different, deep strength in their endurance. To live a life of hardship without letting it harden you completely, that was its own defiance. 2. Kneel not because you were weak, but because you knew you could rise again tomorrow. That too was resistance. And so, they endured, quietly, without monuments or epic songs. They endured in the rhythm of the plow, in the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them, folds them into a footnote beneath kings and conquests. But the peasants were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies marching under banners. They built the world, even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overturned their lords, but they outlasted them. And maybe, just maybe, that is revolution enough. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey to the edge of the map, to a nameless village, and into the lives of those who endured. If this slow history brought you some peace tonight, I'm glad. Feel free to share where you're listening from in the comments. It's always nice to know who's out there in the quiet. Until next time, rest well.